I saw a video recently called "This is what a second-person video game would look like" by a creator called Nick Robinson, Babylonian. The video is 5 years old, has about 34 million views, and posed an interesting question. However, most of the video was focused on a particular mission from the game Driver San Francisco, and how it was arguably an example of second-person perspective in gaming.
Now, after that cutscene ends, you are back in Ordell's body in the first person with Layla sitting to your right. But then, you press the throttle to accelerate, and the car in front of you moves. You steer to the left and to the right, and the car in front of you moves to the left and then to the right. And then quickly, it sinks in that the car you're controlling is actually the car you're following. Your perspective as the player is entirely separate from what you're controlling as the player.
While I found this interesting and liked the video, I feel that Nick didn't really delve as deeply into the promised premise as I wanted him to. And so, I would like to offer up my own 2 cents on this topic. What would a second-person perspective look like in a video game? And that answer is not at all straightforward. Things get complicated quickly when you really delve into this subject. Let's start with a quick explanation of what first, second, and third person are in literature. The easiest way to explain it is through the use of dun-dun-dun pronouns.
Fucking pronouns!
A first-person narrative uses I and my and pronouns like that. So if you're reading a first-person novel, it's I went to the meeting. I met my contact under the bridge. A first-person novel is told from the perspective of a character in the narrative. Usually the central character, but not always. For instance, the Sherlock Holmes stories by Arthur Conan Doyle are written from the perspective of Holmes's sidekick, Dr. John Watson. A third-person novel, on the other hand, uses pronouns like he and she and they. The narrator is outside the events of the story, describing what happens to the characters rather than speaking as one of the characters. Third person is by far the most common perspective in fiction because it gives the author the freedom to move between different characters, show scenes that the protagonist does not witness, and provide commentary or context that the character themselves might not be aware of. Now, there are different kinds of third-person narratives, such as third-person limited and third-person omniscient, but we don't really need to get into that here. The important thing is just that the narrative is unfolding through the perspective of a narrator who is viewing events from outside of the characters themselves. So, what is the second-person perspective? It's a perspective you're unlikely to see in narrative fiction, as it directly addresses you, the reader, as the subject of the story. Instead of I or he, she, they, everything is phrased as you. For example, you walk into the room. You notice the faint smell of smoke. You sit down, trying not to look nervous. And this creates a strange effect. On the one hand, it can be very immersive. It feels like the story is happening to you. On the other hand, it can also be very alienating because the author is telling you what you do, what you think, what you feel. And that might not line up with your own instincts. That's why second-person perspective is fairly rare in novels. Though if you've ever read a choose-your-own-adventure book, you've likely encountered it there. The funny thing is that I actually wrote a second-person novel in my late teens. It was called Red Day, and it pretty much sucks. It's full of shocking for the sake of being shocking teenage edginess. And it was written in second person, not to serve any sort of narrative need, but just to be different. I'll give you a little sample. The alarm clock goes off like an air raid siren in the darkness of your cluttered bedroom. For a moment, you have no idea where you are. The weight of your identity sinks in again, and the wet dreams that permeated your turbulent sleep fade away into erotic apparitions that dance with the shadows that squirm and writhe in the den of iniquity that your young mind has become. Oof. Did I mention I was a teenager when I wrote this? Anyway, as much as I hate and disown the results of my experiment, I am one of the very human beings on the face of the earth to ever write a novel entirely in second-person perspective. It may be an awful novel that no one should ever read, but it does exist. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end, and at 50,934 words, it does just barely qualify as novel length. So yes, I wrote a second-person novel, and in doing so, I became the world's foremost expert on second-person narrative. Thank you very much. So let's talk about perspective in video games. And more importantly, let's talk about how the very concept of first, second, and third-person narrative kind of breaks down in the translation from one medium, writing, to another medium, video games. So, first-person perspective in literature is when the story takes place from the perspective of a character within the narrative. So it makes sense that in video games, first-person means the camera is situated inside the character's head. You're not reading, I went to the meeting. You're literally seeing through the eyes of the character as they go to the meeting. Doom, Half-Life, Call of Duty, Skyrim. These are all straightforward examples. The sense of immersion comes from aligning the player's perspective with the characters. Seems simple enough, right? Well, it's not. And I'll explain why in a moment. But first, let's talk third person. In literature, once again, third-person perspective is when the narrator describes events from outside the characters. He did this. She went there. They felt afraid. You're not being told the story by a character within it, and you're not being directly cast as the subject. Instead, you're watching the drama unfold at arm's length, guided by a voice that has no real stake in the action. In video games, this translates pretty naturally into what we call third-person games. Here, the camera is not inside the character's head. It's pulled back, hovering over their shoulder, trailing just behind them, or sometimes floating above the scene entirely. Think of games like The Witcher 3 or Assassin's Creed or Tomb Raider or Uncharted. You're still controlling the protagonist, but the perspective makes it clear that you are not them. You are directing them. But when you try to nail down what second-person perspective looks like in a video game, all of this kind of falls the fuck apart. Second person, in literature, is when you are the subject of the story. The narration doesn't say, I did this or he did this. It says, you did this. You walk into the room. You pick up the gun. You feel the weight of it in your hands. The text is pointing a finger directly at you and declaring what you did, what you think, what you feel. So here is my issue. When you play a video game and you are playing as the main character and seeing things through their eyes, we call that first person. But couldn't it just as easily be called second person? Think about it. if a text adventure says, you enter the cave, you see a monster staring at you, that's undeniably a second-person narration. But if a first-person, quote-unquote, video game like Skyrim puts you behind the character's eyes and lets you walk into the cave and you see the monster, well, is not exactly the same goddamn thing? You are the subject. You are being told that you do this. Only instead of words on a page, the game is showing you directly. That's the problem. The boundaries between first and second person blur when you move from the written word to an interactive medium. In literature, second person is unusual because the writer hijacks your identity and prescribes what you do. In video games, that's literally every second of play. The entire medium is built on the premise. You press a button, you swing a sword, you open a door, you die. So, why do we default to calling this first person? Mostly because of the camera. First person is just shorthand for seeing through the character's eyes. But if you strip away the camera and focus on the actual relationship between player and action, you could argue that almost every video game, text adventures, visual novels, shooters, whatever, they are all second person at their core. The system is always telling you, implicitly or explicitly, you are here, you are doing this. Really, what's called third person in video games could also be called second person. Think about it. If you are reading a second person narrative, you are observing a character that is being identified as you having an adventure. And isn't that still what's happening when you play a third-person video game? Now, the character may have their own identity, their own name, their own look, but at the end of the day, who is controlling their actions? You are. The game presents this figure on the screen and basically says, this is you. Sure, they might be called Lara Croft or Geralt or something, but as soon as the controller is in your hands, that character becomes an extension of your will. That's why when you lose, you don't say, shit, Lara Croft died. You say, shit, I died. I think that we have to come to a conclusion here that may be dissatisfying. That the narrative device of literary perspectives doesn't really parse well to the world of video games. Because perspective in the realm of literature and perspective in the realm of video games are two completely different things. Perspective in literature is about narrative voice. Who is telling the story? And from what grammatical vantage point? Perspective in video games, on the other hand, is about camera placement and player agency. It's not just who is speaking, but who is seeing and who is doing. And those don't line up neatly. The truth is that while first person and third person in video games are apt descriptions for camera placement, they don't really work on the deeper level of narrative perspective. They were borrowed terms, a kind of shorthand that helped players and designers explain where the lens of the game was. But unlike literature, where perspective is fixed by language, video games are dynamic and interactive. They collapse those roles. The player is the reader and the narrator and the protagonist all at once. In novels, second person is rare and strange because the author prescribes your thoughts and actions to you. In games, that's just the baseline state of play. You press the button, the game tells you what you did. By that standard, every video game is secretly second person. So maybe a more apt question would be, what does an actual first person and third person game look like? A third person video game would no longer be a video game. It would just be a movie. A first-person video game would also cease to be a video game, and it would just be a more experimental movie, like Hardcore Henry. Because the second you introduce the concept of your agency, what you get is essentially a second-person experience by default. The very act of pressing a button and watching the avatar respond is the game pointing at you and saying, you did this. The entire medium is built on that loop of instruction and response. You jump, you shoot, you die. So if we're being honest, almost every traditional video game is second-person at its core, no matter where the camera is placed. The so-called first-person and third-person labels only describes where the lens is sitting, not the actual narrative perspective. The actual perspective, the relationship between the player and the avatar, is almost always second-person because the system is always addressing you directly. But look, I am not jumping to the conclusion that all games are second person. I know it sounds like I just did that, but what I'm telling you is actually something a little different. I'm saying that it was a mistake to think that grafting literary perspective onto video games was ever really going to work cleanly in the first place. The terms first person, second person, and third person are products of literature, where perspective is a matter of grammar and narrative voice. But games are not books. They are interactive systems. The relationship between player, avatar, and world is something novels never had to account for. And in fact, when authors do write interactive books, like the aforementioned Choose Your Own Adventure books, you'll notice that this is the one instance where it becomes standard practice to use the otherwise broadly neglected second-person perspective. Because as soon as choice enters the picture, the you becomes unavoidable. The book has to address you directly. You open the door, you fight the monster, you fall into the pit. Interactivity demands a second-person framework because the whole mechanism depends on collapsing the reader into the protagonist. That's why those books feel different from standard novels. The perspective is not a stylistic flourish, it is a functional necessity of turning the book into an interactive medium. Video games inherit that same necessity by default. The second you hand a controller to a player, the system is effectively saying, you are doing this. Whether the camera is tucked behind a pair of eyeballs, or hovering above your shoulder, or looking at you down from the clouds, that doesn't change the core fact that the game is addressing the player directly through action. Which is why trying to map literary personhood onto games is ultimately a dead end. In literature, perspective is about who tells the story. In games, perspective is about who acts within the story, and that's almost always the player. The literary framework can be used as a metaphor, but it breaks down pretty quickly once you look closely. But if we want to treat perspective merely as a matter of camera placement, which I think, by the way, would be and is a disservice to the medium of gaming, then I think it has to be accepted that no such thing as a second-person perspective exists by that definition. There is no camera placement that creates the pure literary equivalent of second person from a camera perspective. Driver San Francisco flirted with the idea by making you see yourself from another driver's POV, but that's just a trick of framing. Not really altogether all that different from Watson being the narrator of the Sherlock Holmes books. So here's the paradox. If we use the literary definition, then every game is already second person because interactivity collapses the gap between narrator and player. If we restrict person to camera placement, then second person does not exist at all. It's just an empty category, a phantom term that ultimately means nothing. Either way, the literary grammar does not fit. I think games demand their own grammar, something that reflects the realities of the medium and its inherent properties. I think we need terminology that more directly recognizes things like camera placement, levels of agency, levels of identity. Are you directly controlling an avatar, or are you influencing them at a distance, like in The Sims or something? Are you inhabiting their body as an extension of your own, or are you guiding them like a puppet on strings? Are you being spoken to directly by the game, or are you just implied through the mechanics? These distinctions matter far more than whether the camera is inside or outside of a head. That is all.